From the Adult Forum at Christ Episcopal Church on August 9th, 2026. This is the Reverend Jeri Gray-Reneberg speaking on domestic violence. Why is it still with us? What is domestic violence, also called intimate partner violence? This is from the publication Domestic Violence, a Public Health Education and Resource Guide that I wrote in 1996. The term fight or dispute connotes two or more individuals of roughly equal social standing disagreeing emphatically, perhaps using loud, harsh words, and even perhaps resorting to physical violence. Domestic violence, on the other hand, is caused by beliefs surrounding the use of power and control to gain compliance. It differs from a fight not only in degree, but also intention. The purpose of fighting is to communicate, to debate, to convince, or maybe to overpower. The purpose of battering is to intersperse terrorizing behaviors with threats in order to dominate and control another person's life. Abuse is the use of or threat of physical or sexual violence calculated to coerce the partner to do something one wants, to degrade or humiliate, or to gain or maintain a sense of power or control. Abusive behaviors create an atmosphere of intimidation in a relationship. Studies over time have shown that in heterosexual relationships, 85 to 95% of domestic or intimate partner violence is perpetrated by the male. When a woman is arrested, the violence is often self-defense or in response to long-term abuse. There are three main parts to my focus on domestic violence today: my family's and my own stories, some history of domestic violence and religion in America, and where we stand today. I'll start with my family's story and my own. My family's story begins in 1933, many years before I was born, when my dad's father married his mother. I don't know when it started, and I can't ask my dad anymore, but he and his sister Judy and brother Joe grew up in a household where his father regularly abused his mother. As far as I know, Grandma didn't grow up in an abusive home, and I don't think my grandfather knew violence in the home he was raised in. But my grandfather Horace was an alcoholic, and when I was old enough to hear about it, I heard that he was a mean drunk. Dad was the oldest, the protector of his mother, and shared many of her personality characteristics. He married Mom at age 18, and they were simpatico and always seemed much in love. They had 3 girls together. I'm the oldest. Dad didn't perpetuate in our family the violence he witnessed growing up, and many of his friends and colleagues saw him as an extraordinarily sensitive and caring person. He spent many years of his career as the assistant for business administration to 2 bishops in the South Pacific District of the American Lutheran Church. He was never ordained, but he was clergy adjacent. I still miss him terribly. He died in November 2020. His sister Judy, the middle child, and 3 years younger than Dad, was impacted in a different way. She was a romantic child and spent much time daydreaming about being married. When her parents finally divorced, she was 14 and resented her mother for her father no longer being around. As she grew older, she found herself drawn to evangelical groups, specifically Billy Graham's Youth for Christ. It was at one of those meetings or rallies that she met her future husband, Frank. He was from Virginia, in the Air Force, a tall, dark, and handsome man. She saw him as a man of strong Christian faith, and she married him quickly and naively at age 19. Here is their wedding photo. Both Judy and Frank look happy and hopeful. However, according to a story that she recounted years later, that night her life changed. Now that Judy was legally his wife, Her new husband used sexual violence to make her aware of that fact. Her life would never be the same. 5 years later, they had their only child, a son named Tommy, and the violence continued. Her conservative beliefs kept her from leaving him. About 6 years later, Judy was found unconscious one day by a neighbor. She was taken to the hospital. Then Frank admitted her to a nursing home for long-term care. She was suffering from brain damage, most likely due to the abuse. When Grandma found out, she spent 2 years trying to get her released to her care. In the interim, Frank divorced Judy, claiming simply a 2-year separation, and promptly remarried. Judy eventually went to live with Grandma and my step-grandfather before her accidental death several years later. It never could be proved, but Grandma always believed that Frank caused her near-fatal injury. I tried for many years to locate Tommy. Then, amazingly, I had a breakthrough 2 weeks ago in my ancestry search. Frank died in a suburb of Nashville in 2019 and is buried there in a veterans cemetery. It seems that Tommy lived nearby and preceded him in death in 2015. He also went into the service, serving in the Marines. I have no record of any marriage or children. My own story begins with a long solo drive from Southern California to Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I began to pursue my Master of Divinity in 1980. It was only 10 years after American Lutherans had begun ordaining women to be pastors, and I have memories that are both precious and profound, and also deeply unsettling. With one semester left of my 4-year degree, I was confronted by my seminary advisor with the words of someone who was deeply sexist, who described my leadership style as feminine frailty. Instead of defending me, knowing that I was engaged, he suggested that I get married, start my family, and then consider returning to finish up. At that point, I took a leave of absence from seminary, wondering if sexism would always be an impediment to my ordination. I had all but forgotten my aunt's tragic story at this time, although the pursuit of justice always motivated me. But in 1985, something serendipitous happened. I was hired by a local Denver women's shelter to work with abused women. The executive director and staff were happy to hear of my theological education, which was part of why they had hired me. And I heard the questions and comments other staff hadn't known how to answer. The women would ask me, "Why is God doing this to me?" Or they would say, "My pastor told me that God has healed my husband and asked me, why can't you believe that?" I eventually realized that I needed to finish my degree and be ordained. 3 years later, in a Lutheran Episcopal Church in the Denver area, my first ministry was to continue to work with abused women through the shelters, now adding sacramental ministry and educating congregations about domestic violence. I held weekly women's Eucharists, performed baptisms and other services of the church as requested, and counseled women in the shelters who had questions of faith. In succeeding years, before I left the DV field and returned to regular church ministry, you'll notice on the cake there the Episcopal shield, I served as domestic violence program manager at the Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence in Ventura, and coordinator of the Domestic Violence Prevention Program of the Lincoln-Lancaster County Health Department, where I wrote and edited domestic violence materials for the general public and for clergy. I also worked in DV adjacent fields, as when I served as volunteer coordinator for Planned Parenthood of Omaha Council Bluffs. I've served on boards of the Greater Iowa Planned Parenthood Advisory Board, and since moving to Humboldt County 23 years ago, I served on the local governing boards of Humboldt Domestic Violence Services and Six Rivers Planned Parenthood, before returning to active ministry. For 22 years, I've been a member of Clergy for Choice, now Clergy for Reproductive Freedom, through Planned Parenthood of Northern California. And you'll notice Deacon Ann there. I didn't know it at the time, but in 1984, just before I was hired by Women in Crisis in Arvada, Colorado, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act was passed by Congress. It was the beginning of federal funding for domestic violence shelters, 24-hour crisis hotlines, and community-based services. All the shelters in the Denver area, Women in Crisis, Gateway, Alternatives to Family Violence, and the Denver Safe House, began to expand their services. We allied with rape crisis centers and participated in Take Back the Night marches. I wrote funded grants to support my ministry with abused women. And in 1994, just before I was hired by the Lincoln-Lancaster County Health Department to create domestic violence materials for the general public and for clergy, the first Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, was passed by Congress. Cities, towns, and rural areas began to hold offenders accountable and to provide legal assistance, as well as to expand on the availability of crisis hotlines and shelter and hotel beds. Lincoln, Nebraska, and you'll note there the Lincoln Capitals, looks unlike any other. Home to the Cornhuskers of the University of Nebraska, also had a thriving ecumenical community in 1996 when I was living there. It's also where I happened to be born and where my father grew up. The Health Promotion and Outreach Division of the Lincoln-Lancaster County Health Department had just received a generous grant to develop domestic violence prevention materials for the community, and I was hired to fill that role. Over the course of the next year, I used material I already had and researched what was new and what the community was doing. I developed Domestic Violence, a public health education and resource guide, a general guide for the community, and a companion booklet, Domestic Violence, a focus guide for clergy and religious leaders. Other companion booklets for healthcare providers, employers, and educators had already been developed or were in the process of development. But Steve Beal, my supervisor, was thrilled that I had a theological education and could bring that education and experience with domestic violence to the clergy booklet. The table of contents in the general guide includes these topics: identifying the problem, the battered woman's motivation, what keeps an abuser from battering, what works with battering men, what can I do, issues of special populations, rural, teenaged and dating women, older women, same-sex domestic violence, women of color, immigrant and refugee women, women with disabilities, and pregnant women. And what is Lincoln doing? A final word: can we perpetuate justice where we are? Selected bibliography and appendixes A and B. Included in the guide is a key resource called the Power and Control and Equality Wheels. Developed by the Duluth Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, DAPE, they were intended to be used with their abusers' treatment program, Power and Control, Tactics of Men Who Batter. They show graphically how a system of power and control supports violence and how alternatively a system of equality supports nonviolence. What you'll see in the power and control wheel is that on the outside is physical and sexual violence, and the spokes in the middle have these categories: using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, using male privilege, using economic abuse, using coercion and threats. The equality wheel, you can see that the outside says nonviolence, and the categories inside are negotiation and fairness, non-threatening behavior, respect, trust and support, honesty and accountability, responsible parenting, shared responsibility, and economic partnership. As I was planning the contents of the clergy booklet, a friend suggested that I adapt the wheels to include scriptural references. With the permission of DAPE, I did just that, using scriptural references and quotes from church fathers, reformers, and other influential people of faith on the power and control and equality wheels. My task was made easier by using the Leonard Swidler book, Biblical Affirmations of Woman. That book has an opening section on feminine imagery of God, but also contains positive, negative, and ambivalent elements regarding women in the Hebrew Jewish tradition, as well as in the Christian tradition. I named the wheels Power and Control of Women in Patriarchal Society, and women created in God's image as equal to men. Inside the wedges, I included corresponding negative and positive verses from the traditions. I didn't attempt to exegete the texts. I simply used them in their plain meaning, as they've often been used as weapons or blessings in our culture. And what seemed most significant was the quotes I found to include on the outside of the wheels. Here are a few of each. This first one is from St. Augustine. Woman together with her husband is in the image of God, but when she's referred to separately, then she's not the image of God. This is from Martin Luther. A woman is not fully the master of herself, and whenever Katie gets saucy, she gets nothing but a box on the ear. This is from John Calvin. We do not find ourselves permitted by the word of God, however, to advise a woman to leave her husband, not even when he beats her. This is St. Thomas Aquinas. Man is the beginning and end of woman, just as God is the beginning and end of every creature. And finally, Tertullian. You, woman, are the devil's gateway. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. And this is the women created in God's image as equal to men wheel. And because I could not put these quotes on the outside, I have a page of those, and I'll read them to you. The first is from the 1972 Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Society of Friends, Quakers. There is one teacher, namely Christ, and in his spirit there are no distinctions between persons, nor any reason of age, sex, or race that elects some to domination. Combativeness in family life, whereby man and wife, or parents and children, strive to assert a supremacy of will, is not compatible with the conviction that there is that of God in everyone. Then the next one is Dame Julian of Norwich, many of us think highly of. And though possibly an earthly mother may suffer her child to perish, our heavenly mother Jesus can never suffer us who are his children to perish. For he is almighty, all wisdom, and all love. From Sarah Grimke, Quaker abolitionist. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God has designed for us to occupy. This is from the Reverend William Sloane Coffin. Men who repress in themselves the feminine side of their nature will generally be anti-feminine. The woman most in need of liberation is the woman in every man. When at last this woman is liberated, along with the man in every woman, Our homes, the churches, and the world will be much better places. There can no longer be true community between women and men unless that community is based on full equality. This is from Catherine Booth, Holiness Evangelist. If she have the necessary gifts and feels herself called by the Spirit to preach, there's not a single word in the whole book of God to restrain her, but many, very many, to urge and encourage her. God says she shall do so. Finally, this is from W.B. Godby, Methodist Evangelist. It is a God-given, blood-bought privilege and bounden duty of the women as well as the men to preach the gospel. As I say in my reflections on the wheels, I found that most of the biblical texts referring to women, directly or indirectly, are found on the wheel called Women Created in God's Image as Equal to Men. There are specifically 73 total positive, as compared to 26 total negative text listed. There are, in addition, some ambivalent texts which are not included on either wheel. It is striking that of the 73 positive texts, 50 are found in the Gospels and in Acts. In other words, 68% of the positive texts about women are to be found in the words and actions of Jesus, and in Jesus' immediate legacy to the early Christian church. By contrast, no references from the Gospels or the book of Acts are found on the wheel entitled Power and Control of Women in Patriarchal Society. Instead, on the outside ring, we find many quotations by several of the influential church fathers. Although there are several significant quotations encircling the women created in God's image wheel, I'm sorry to say that none carry the same weight as those spoken by the church fathers, who in many cases systematized Christian theology. This is the heritage received by all women. Because of this heritage, many centuries passed before women were allowed to own property, to vote, to decide whether or whom to marry, and to speak the word of God in the public arena. Because of this heritage, many centuries passed before women were no longer subject to the chastising of their husbands by any means, including domestic violence. Have you heard of the rule of thumb? It originally meant that a man could not use a switch or stick any larger in diameter than his thumb to discipline his wife. Now, some more recent history. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the women's movement made great societal advancements. The Violence Against Women Act, passed under President Clinton, was reauthorized 4 more times. In 2000, again under Clinton. In 2005, under President George W. Bush. In 2013, under President Obama. And in 2022, under President Biden. You can see there are safe homes for women, there are shelter grants, Equal Justice for Women in the Courts Act. In the early years, we thought we were making great strides in reducing the incidence of domestic violence and preventing more women, children, and abusers from being killed. But there's so much we didn't know about the backlash that was present under the surface as early as the 20th century in America. The early 20th century in America. Kristen Cobbs-Dumez frames it this way in her 2020 book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. This is quite a book. I recommend it. By the early 20th century, some Christians recognized that they had a masculinity problem. Unable to shake the sense that Christianity had a less than masculine feel, many blamed the faith itself, or at least the feminization of Victorian Christianity, which privileged gentility, restraint, and an emotive response to the gospel message. But American masculinity, too, had recently undergone dramatic changes, contributing to this sense of unease. Throughout much of the 19th century, when most men made a living by farming or otherwise working with their hands, or by owning small businesses, masculinity seemed more of a given. During this time, Christian manhood entailed hard work and thrift, and also the ability to exhibit a proper gentlemanly restraint. Self-denial, after all, was a useful virtue for entrepreneurial businessmen and industrious workers. But by the 1890s, this model of manly restraint had begun to falter with the increase of technology and urbanization. White native-born Protestant men began to assert a new kind of masculinity, a rougher, tougher masculinity. Nothing less than the fate of the nation, even the future of white Christian civilization, appeared to be at stake. Cobbes-Dumas continues. After World War I, and borrowing from modern advertising techniques, evangelical innovators crafted a generic, non-sectarian faith that privileged individuals' plain reading of the Bible and championed a commitment to the pure, unadulterated fundamentals of the faith. Branding this innovative approach old-time religion, you can see here, if you're familiar with the movie Inherit the Wind, they then marketed this faith directly to consumers. Through religious merchandising and with the help of celebrity pitchmen like Billy Sunday himself, they effectively replaced traditional denominational authorities with the authority of the market and the power of consumer choice. But there were both rabble-rousing populists and respectable middle-class professionals. And it was only through the identification of common enemies that fundamentalists were able to fashion a powerful, if unstable, identity. Fortunately for them, enemies weren't hard to find. Religious modernists, too, had wanted to make their faith relevant to the changing times, but they rejected fundamentalists' plain reading of the Bible. Accusing fundamentalists of substituting propagandism for a proper scholarly study of the Bible, they preferred to look to higher critical scholarship to parse the intricacies of the scriptures. These liberal Protestants also tended to emphasize the social and environmental dimensions of Christianity over against fundamentalists' more individualistic focus on personal sin and conversion. Does that sound familiar? Fundamentalists, in turn, accused modernists of abandoning the historic Christian faith. In the Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, the issues played out in this way. Cobbes-Dumas says, until the end of the 1960s, Southern Baptists held varying views on gender roles. Some believed the Bible prohibited women from preaching and teaching, while others supported women's religious leadership. By 1979, conservative Southern Baptists' sense of cultural crisis was acute, and they set out to take over the denomination. Accounts of the battles over the SBC commonly focus on the question of biblical inerrancy, but the battle over inerrancy was in part a proxy fight over gender. Evangelical feminism had been making inroads in Southern Baptist circles, and growing numbers of Baptist women had begun challenging male headship and claiming leadership positions. Between 1975 and 1985, the number of women ordained in the SBC increased significantly. These women insisted on interpreting biblical texts contextually, attentive to the settings in which they were produced. Conservatives, however, insisted on a populist hermeneutic, a method privileging the simplest, most direct interpretations of Scripture. For conservatives, this wasn't just the right method, it was also the masculine one. They depicted biblical authors like Paul as uncowed by political correctness. Paul wasn't afraid to prohibit female authority, and masculine men should do likewise. They accused liberals and moderates of waffling, of introducing needless complexity while they stood firm in their quick grasp of the obvious, literal truth of the scriptures. The issue of inerrancy did rally conservatives, but when it turned out that large numbers of Southern Baptists, even denominational officials, lacked any real theological prowess and were in fact functionally atheological, concerns over inerrancy gave way to a newly politicized commitment to female submission and to related culture wars issues. Within a generation, Southern Baptists began to place their evangelical identity over their identity as Southern Baptists. Patriarchy was at the heart of this new sense of themselves. More recently, author Cynthia Miller Idris makes a case for sexism and misogyny being at the heart of the violent extremism and terroristic mass murders we've seen in America over many years. In her 2025 book, Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, she says, in several recent studies across a wide range of national contexts, hostile sexism and misogynist attitudes emerge as significant, and in some cases the biggest, predictors of support for political violence and violent extremism. In nationally representative data across several countries, hostile sexist attitudes are more important than religiosity, age, gender, level of education, and employment in predicting support for violent extremism. Men who believe masculinity is defined by strength, dominance, power, and toughness, and who hold a hierarchical view where women are less valued than and submissive to men, engage in sexual and intimate partner violence significantly more than those who do not hold those views. The relationship works in reverse. Research studies have shown that support for women's advancement or empowerment through gender equality reduces the likelihood of a wide variety of harmful and violent outcomes, including rape and rape threats, domestic and intimate partner violence, and political attacks targeting women. Supporting violence against women or experiencing childhood exposure to violence in the form of domestic or intimate partner violence and bullying, on the other hand, is correlated with reduced resilience to violent extremism. She continues, in some cases, popular online influencers and creators promise tangible success, wealth, sex, power, in self-help plans that are accompanied by tremendous amounts of misogyny, racism, or other hurtful content. She says, in January 2023, I began fielding calls from journalists who had heard from parents and teachers that teenage boys were expressing a surprising number of misogynistic ideas in class or at home. This was no surprise to me or my team in my research lab, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL. 2 years earlier, we had all listened as a middle school mom in a webinar complained that during the highly online period of pandemic learning, her son had adopted new misogynistic beliefs so severe that he no longer would listen to her as an expert on anything because she is a woman. And throughout 2022 and early 2023, a variety of news reports began to warn parents and teachers about an uptick in violent misogyny being expressed by teenage boys. Teenagers in the UK, Canada, the United States, and elsewhere have reported impacts like a huge increase in rape jokes among boys, as well as comments that casually praise men as better than women, and refusals to do assignments handed out by a woman because women should only be housewives. One teacher reported hearing a young student in the playground introduce his girlfriend to a group, and as soon as she was out of earshot, he was asked by several friends if they could have a go with her. Some teachers and education experts blame this disturbing increase in part on creators like self-described misogynist and online influencer Andrew Tate. Tate and his brother Tristan, who are dual U.S. British citizens, were recently arrested in the U.S. There are 59 charges in total, all related to sexual violence against women and children. While teaching dating academy tactics to degrade and manipulate women, he compares women to dogs, advocates for their physical abuse as a mechanism of control, and says he believes that they shouldn't drive or work outside the home. Tate doesn't only peddle misogyny and abuse of women, he also embeds it within an ecosystem of self-help and self-improvement guidance, urging young men to get up off the couch and embrace a gym bro culture that rejects therapy and believes depression isn't real. It's hard to overstate his popularity with boys and young men. In February 2024, a new UK report revealed that 1 in 5 men between ages 16 and 29 view Tate favorably. Data from the United States reveals similar trends. In 2023, 18 to 23-year-old men were more likely to say they trust Andrew Tate than then President Joe Biden, 20% to 15%. Miller Idris concludes about the increase in violence since 2020. Already high rates of domestic and intimate partner violence jumped at least 8% in the country during the first years of the pandemic, while resources and services available to victims declined or were diverted to COVID-19 medical needs. The same period saw an upsurge in child abuse and maltreatment, despite plummeting reports to authorities, as mandatory reporters like teachers and school counselors no longer saw most students in person. Rates of rape have increased in the United States since nearly every year since 2013, when the FBI revised the definition, while well over half of rapes go unreported to begin with. And murders of trans and gender non-conforming people in the United States have sharply increased in recent years. At least 288 trans and gender non-conforming people were killed in the United States between 2017 and mid-2024. Some recent setbacks for the domestic violence movement include a case decided by the Supreme Court in 2000, United States versus Morrison, which according to Wikipedia arose from a challenge to a provision of the Violence Against Women Act that provided victims of gender-motivated violence the right to sue their attackers in federal court. The decision was 5-4, as they often are, deciding that the Commerce Clause gave Congress only the power to regulate activities that were directly economic in nature, even if there were indirect economic consequences. Rehnquist, this was the Rehnquist court, also held that the Equal Protection Clause did not authorize the law because the clause applies only to acts by states, not to acts by private individuals. The US government argued that VAWA appropriately enforced the Equal Protection Clause's ban on governmental gender discrimination. The government argued that pervasive gender stereotypes and assumptions permeated state justice systems, and that such forms of state bias led to insufficient investigation and prosecution of gender-motivated crime, inappropriate focus on the behavior and credibility of the victims of that crime, and unacceptably lenient punishments for those who are actually convicted of gender-motivated violence. In a July 28th article in the New York Times, What the Crack-Up of the Heritage Foundation Says About the Post-Trump Right, author Elizabeth Zarofsky speaks about a member of the conservative Heritage Foundation, Scott Yenor, who joined Heritage in 2025. Yenor, a professor of political science at Boise State University, has long focused on family policy. While there had long been informal discussions about whether feminism had gone too far, Yenor took the debate to another level. Yenor believes that first-wave feminism, women's suffrage, was a mistake. That women shouldn't enjoy legal protection from discrimination at work. That professional women are medicated, meddlesome, and quarrelsome. And that a healthy society requires patriarchy. These views were not confined to Yenor at Heritage. Conversations were held openly about whether only male heads of households should be able to vote. Also discussed was whether Heritage, in its special report on family policy, should support an annual multi-trillion-dollar direct wealth transfer from single people to married couples with children via changes in the tax code. Domestic violence programs are currently struggling with a $150 million deficit related to money that should have been distributed in fiscal 2025 to help survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and trafficking. This administration's justification for this delay is apparently related to its focus on whether undocumented people should receive services, as well as whether or not there is fraud, two themes that we all have heard frequently in the last year. In Humboldt County, Humboldt Domestic Violence Services said last October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, that the 24-hour hotline has seen an increase in numbers since 2020, according to Community Outreach Coordinator Nyla Smith, who added, "More people are hearing about and taking advantage of our services." My question is, would this be a good thing if the increase is due to greater visibility, or a bad thing if episodes of violence are increasing? Cynthia Miller Idris points out, private violence may well become a training ground for subsequent public violence, and men who are violent at home or in their personal lives may well be acting on childhood traumas that also impact the likelihood of their subsequent public rage. But ultimately, these contentions still fit within what I suggest is the more compelling explanatory frame. Domestic and intimate partner violence is not only about the control of a single woman, but rather it is about control of all women. Men who are violent against lovers, sisters, mothers, and wives do so to assert, maintain, or defend their own dominance and demand deference to their entitlement to status, power, and service from others. Both types of male violence, private, intimate, and public, terroristic, are rooted in misogynistic attitudes, an impulse for power and control, and the violent defense of the patriarchal order and the clarity of roles and purpose it provides for many men. Men who enact violence against women in their personal lives often do so in anger based on aggrieved entitlement and rage directed toward women because of a perceived loss of status and identity in the patriarchal hierarchy. This type of aggrieved entitlement is also a risk factor for the perpetuation of mass violence. Finally, she reminds us, women, as a 2024 viral man versus bear phenomenon illustrates, in which women weighed in on whether they would feel safer running into a bear or a strange man in the woods, live with a bigger and more relentless set of fears founded in their tangible experience. A large number of women in various online videos about the comparison insist that they would pick the bear for a variety of reasons, including that they know what to expect from a bear and how to survive the encounter, and they know that people would believe them about being attacked by a bear. Those answers are driven by hard life experience. About a third of us, she says, as I recently explained while describing why I would choose the bear, have already been held down or hit by a man. That prior experience guides our hypervigilance, our decision making, and our choice of the bear, who we presume would at the very least not enjoy the pain inflicted, nor blame us for it. After all of this, you may ask, what can we do? Here's a suggestion. In 1991, the Women's Global Leadership Institute began a campaign called 16 Days of Activism, focusing on preventing and eliminating violence against women and girls. It begins with the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women on November 25th and ends on December 10th, International Human Rights Day. In 2022, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church passed a resolution calling on the Episcopal Church to observe the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women each year on the Sunday closest to November 25th, as Break the Silence Sunday. Might we start planning to observe that campaign in some way? That's all. Thank you.